Today, we're diving deep into that constant voice chattering away inside your head, what we're calling the inner narrator. We're going to look at the actual science behind it and explore a pretty radical idea for how you might be able to silence it for good.
Seriously, think about it. When was the last time your mind was just empty? No inner monologue, no planning, no replaying conversations. If you're like most people, the answer is probably never. It feels like our brains are always on, always busy, even when we're trying to just chill out. You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? You're driving, and suddenly you snap back to reality and have no idea how you navigated the last 5 miles. Or you're standing in the shower, and your mind is already in a meeting that's 3 hours away. Well, that autopilot mode, that's the star of our show today. That's your brain's inner narrator.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to put a real scientific name to this inner voice. Then we'll dive into something called the trap of false bliss, which is all about why just feeling relaxed isn't the same as true silence. After that, we'll look at a technique for actually shutting the whole network down, talk about what that experience is really like, and wrap things up with a huge idea about where consciousness itself might come from.
All right, let's kick things off. This voice isn't just some vague philosophical concept. Nope, neuroscientists can actually see it light up on a brain scan. It's a very real system called the default mode network, or DMN for short. So the DMN is basically your brain's cruise control. It's what automatically turns on the second you stop focusing on a specific task. It's the part of you that daydreams, that worries about the future, that replays the past, and most importantly, it's the part that constantly builds and maintains your sense of I. It's literally the engine of your inner world. And the source material gives us this awesome analogy to understand how it works. Think of the DMN as a two-person film crew inside your head. You've got the medial prefrontal cortex, the MPFC, and that's the narrator. It's the voice telling the story of me, me, me. Then you have the posterior cingulate cortex, or PCC. That's the display screen. It's constantly pulling up old memories and projecting future scenarios for the narrator to comment on, and together they create that nonstop movie of your inner life. Okay, so if the DMN is this inner narrator, a lot of us try to quiet it down with stuff like meditation, right? But here's where we hit a really crucial idea from the source material. There's a huge trap that many people fall into, mistaking a feeling of bliss for genuine mental silence. You know, you do a mindfulness exercise, your breathing slows down, your nervous system chills out, and you feel great. You feel peaceful. But the big question is, did you actually silence the narrator? Or did you just give it a quieter, more pleasant script to read from? Is that DMN still running the show, just kind of humming in the background? And this slide just lays it out perfectly. On one side, you have that superficial relaxation. The source calls this the trap of bliss. Your DMN is still on, maybe whispering instead of shouting, but it's still there. It feels nice, sure, but it's temporary and kind of deceptive. On the other side, you have absolute mental silence. This is a whole different ballgame. This is the DMN being turned completely offline. The narrator is gone. That simulation of I just ceases. All that's left is pure awareness, and this is presented as the real goal of a practice called delta meditation.
Okay, so if the goal is to actually pull the plug on this network, not just turn down the volume, how in the world do you do that? Well, this leads us to a very specific technique from our source material called the mind silence lock.
Now, this is described as a very active process, not a passive one. First, you use direct intention. You are actively guiding your focus, or intent, as the source calls it, to the front of your brain. By doing this, you're lighting up the brain's attention networks. And here's the cool part. Neurologically, the attention network and the default mode network are like a seesaw. When one goes up, the other has to go down. The final step is this cleansing flow, which is meant to clear out any leftover mental clutter.
And get this. Here is a pretty stunning claim made in the source material about how well this works. It suggests you don't need to practice for years and years. Instead, it says that just one single, correctly performed session can be powerful enough to start rewiring the very brain systems that create all that mental noise. That's a bold claim for sure.
So let's just imagine you do it. The DMN goes offline. What is that actually like? I mean, what happens when the voice that has basically defined you for your entire life just vanishes?
Well, the effects are described as nothing short of a total psychological reset. That sense of I, the ego, it just dissolves. Because it's gone, deeper psychological concepts like Carl Jung's shadow or archetypes have nothing to latch onto, so they lose their power. The source even claims that the whole framework for mental illness, which is so often tied to the ego, just becomes irrelevant. The line between you and the world blurs and fades, and all that's left is pure, simple awareness.
This quote just nails the idea perfectly. We always think the goal is to find peace of mind, but this is suggesting something way deeper. It's not about calming down a troubled mind, it's about reaching a state where the mind that needs to be calmed down in the first place is no longer running the show.
So, this isn't an emotion, like happiness, or a feeling, like calm. It's described as a completely different quality of being. The source calls it living timelessness, because that constant DMN-driven chatter about the past and the future is gone. All that exists is this vast, timeless now.
Now, before we go any further, it is absolutely essential that we state this very clearly. The information and techniques we're talking about here are drawn from sources that focus on deep self-exploration. This is not medical advice. If you are dealing with any physical or mental health conditions, your first and most important step is and always will be to consult with a qualified medical professional.
All right, for our last section, we're going to touch on a really mind-bending question that the source material brings up. If these techniques are so powerful and supposedly novel, where did the knowledge even come from?
The author of our source material specifically says that these insights didn't come from studying ancient texts or academic papers. So that raises a pretty big question, right? If this knowledge wasn't learned in the traditional way, what's its origin?
Well, the hypothesis put forward is pretty wild. It suggests that our brains don't just generate thoughts and ideas, they also act as receivers. In this view, all that constant chatter from the DMN is just like radio static. But if you can silence that static, suddenly the brain can tune in to a much clearer signal, a sort of collective source of information.
And that leads us to this final, really powerful idea. The brain is just the instrument. Awareness is the source. Think of it like a radio. The radio itself doesn't create the music. It just picks up the broadcast. A silent mind, with the DMN offline, is just a perfectly tuned radio, finally able to receive the signal clearly without any distortion.
And that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. We spend our entire lives thinking that inner voice is us. We identify with it completely. But if that narrator, that product of your default mode network, were to fall completely and totally silent, who or what would be left to listen?